Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into a really fascinating economic idea, and we're going to do it by looking at a specific case study from the United States. It's all about the hidden price tag that comes with discrimination. Okay, let's jump right in with the core idea for our entire discussion today. This one sentence, cited from the economist Thomas Sowell, is super powerful. It basically says, hey, you can think whatever you want for free. But the moment you act on that prejudice in the real world, in the marketplace, that's when you start paying a price. So what does this cost actually look like? Well, the source lays out this economic principle pretty clearly. It's all about inefficiency. If you're a business owner and you choose to hire a less qualified person, or maybe you're a customer who chooses a more expensive product simply because of a prejudice, you're the one who pays for it. You lose out on productivity or profits, or you just spend more money. The market, at least in theory, has a way of punishing that. Right, so let's see how this whole principle actually plays out with real people and real money. We're going to start with a pretty surprising historical case study from the US. This isn't just theory. It's about how dollars and cents can shape human behavior in ways you might not expect. Now here's a fascinating tension the author points out. You see this weird split. When people act as a big group, like voters, they might push for and even demand discriminatory laws. But then, when those same people are acting on their own, as individuals trying to run a business or get the best deal, their own self-interest often makes them try to get around the very laws they just supported. And this is where it gets really interesting, especially when we look at the era of legal segregation in the American South. You'd probably assume that businesses were all for these policies, right? But the source material we're looking at tells a totally different story. Get this. The source highlights that it was actually private businesses, the ones driven by profit, who were often fighting against government-mandated segregation. And why? Well, it was just bad for business. Think about it. Having to run separate cars, manage seating arrangements, deal with all the logistics, it was a huge, expensive headache. And this quote just hits the nail on the head. It perfectly captures the conflict. The public and the politicians were looking at it as a social issue, but for the streetcar companies, it was just simple economics. The cost of segregation was a direct hit to their bottom line, and that's why they ended up fighting these laws, in some cases, all the way to the Supreme Court. So the source then fast forwards to a more modern era. It takes this exact same economic lens and applies it to policies it describes as government-enforced pro-minority discrimination, which we commonly know as affirmative action. Let's look at the numbers for a second, because they're pretty staggering. The analysis points to these massive financial incentives that are designed to shape how businesses operate. And this number here, $5.8 billion, that was from just one of these federal set-aside programs in a single year. It just goes to show you the scale of the financial forces at play. The analysis then points to this pretty stark difference in where people work. So the argument from the source is basically this. Because the private sector is so competitive, discrimination is expensive. It costs you money to not hire the best person. But in government, those competitive pressures aren't as direct, and the costs are kind of hidden. And that, the source argues, is why you see this disproportionate employment pattern. Now, this slide is really key to the author's argument because of the timeline. The source points out that the most dramatic economic gains for Black Americans, a drop in the poverty rate from a staggering 87% all the way down to 30%, happened before affirmative action policies were widely put in place in the 1970s. After that, the source states that steep decline pretty much leveled off. So, based on this whole economic breakdown, who actually ends up benefiting from these kinds of policies? Well, the source suggests the answer is a lot more complicated than you might think. What the source argues here is that there is a big gap between the stated goal, helping the disadvantaged as a whole, and who it identifies as the real winners. The analysis concludes that the benefits tend to flow to those who are already in the best position to take advantage of the system. The most educated, the well-connected, and of course, the whole industry of lawyers, consultants, and firms that manage this complex bureaucracy. And this quote from columnist William Raspberry, which the author includes, really crystallizes that point. It's this idea that the benefits often get concentrated way up at the top, while the much larger group of people whose disadvantaged status provides the justification for the programs in the first place don't really see a direct benefit. So this entire U.S. case study, from segregation-era streetcars to modern federal contracts, serves as this one powerful illustration of the source's main principle, that acting on prejudice isn't free. It has real, measurable economic costs. But that leaves us with a really tough final question.
We've seen how economic self-interest can work against discrimination in a free market. But what happens when a government just doesn't care about the cost? What happens when it's willing to crush any market forces to enforce its ideology? Does the principle still hold up?
So, the big takeaway from all this is a new way to look at discrimination. Not just as a moral wrong, but as an economic force with real consequences and costs. And that's exactly what we're going to test next time. Join us as we take a look at the case of Nazi Germany to see if this economic principle holds, even under the most extreme conditions imaginable.